Step into a bizarre cyberpunk dystopia where bureaucracy rules, farm animals are digital currency, and a man's bathroom breaks are the key to power and chaos. The soundtrack of his own Unraveling follows Hatch, a lowly bureaucrat in the sprawling agritech megacity, as he navigates accelerating mutations, uneasy jazz eruptions, and a corporate machine that eats its own. A surreal blend of noir, dark humor, and existential absurdity awaits. Chapter 1, The Bureaucratic Blight. The air in the Department of Agriculture was stale, thick with the unwashed scent of digital livestock and the grinding hum of machinery. Harrison Hatchran leaned over his workstation, an old, flickering terminal blinking in front of him, casting a sickly glow across his face. His job was simple: he processed farm permits, handled digital livestock transfers, and maintained records on the egg quota. But in this cyberpunk dystopia, even the simplest tasks were tangled in endless forms and applications. Bureaucracy was a beast that never stopped consuming. Another day, another egg transaction, Hatch muttered to himself, scrolling through the paperwork with mechanical precision. Eggs pixels, actually, but to anyone else, they were currency. Chickens, too, were worth their weight in code. They roamed freely through the city, attached to their owners by a complex system of blockchain-like ownership certificates. But, in the end, they didn't matter. What mattered was the paperwork. What mattered was the bureaucracy. "Hey, Hatch, you need to take a break." A voice interrupted. It was Mavis, his colleague, leaning over her desk with an eyebrow raised. Mavis was a notorious bathroom user. Rumor had it that the more you went, the more you accelerated, both in work and in social standing. But Hatch was never one for gossip. "Break?" Hatch grumbled. "The only break I'll be taking is when the system finally cracks open and swallows us whole. I've still got paperwork from last week to sort through." But Mavis wasn't deterred. "You're missing out. Haven't you heard? The more you relieve yourself, the faster you move up the ranks. They say the most powerful people in the bureau are the ones who take the most trips to the restroom. Ever wonder why the bathroom lines are so long?" Hatch didn't care. He had a job to do, and that was all that mattered in this farm-like city where everything, from the chickens to the grain, was part of a strange economic machine that no one truly understood. Suddenly, Hatch felt a strange sensation, a gnawing pressure in his abdomen. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It wasn't unusual for someone to have to use the restroom more frequently than normal in this place. It was just a side effect of the system. The more you processed, the more your body seemed to demand these brief interludes of release. Everyone knew it. But what was truly odd, what made Hatch pause, was that he could feel something else this time. The sensation wasn't just physical. It was accelerating. His vision blurred slightly, and the room seemed to stretch before him, as if the walls themselves were moving at a pace faster than normal. He grabbed the edge of his desk to steady himself. The sensation passed, but a faint hum remained in his ears. "You okay?" Mavis asked, concerned. "You look like you've had a moment." Hatch nodded, rubbing his forehead. "Yeah, I need to use the bathroom." Mavis smirked. "Don't hold it in too long. You know what they say, speed is power. You'll be a lot more productive once you go. Just watch yourself when you come back. Things have a way of changing when you move at the right speed." Hatch didn't understand what she meant, but he didn't care. He wasn't interested in getting caught up in whatever strange game Mavis was playing. He had a job to do. Chapter 2, The Acceleration Algorithm. Hatch entered the restroom, the door swishing open with a soft whoosh as he stepped inside. The room was sterile, clean, but the faint hum of electricity filled the air, like the sound of 100 machines at work in the background. The restroom wasn't just a place to relieve oneself, it was also a place where bureaucratic power was cultivated. In the far corner, a small terminal flickered to life. The sign above it read "Speed of process, entry required." Hatch, unsure of what that meant, took a step forward and pressed a button. A low voice emerged from the machine. "Welcome, user 5937. Are you prepared for acceleration?" He didn't know how to answer. Was this some kind of test? Was this about his productivity? But the moment the thought crossed his mind, a strange, undeniable force hit him. The sensation from before the strange acceleration returned, only this time, it wasn't just mental. It was physical. He felt himself jerk forward, as if propelled by an invisible force. His body lurched, and for a brief, disorienting moment, he was moving faster than he had ever moved before. The restroom blurred into a smear of lights and colors, as if the entire space around him was rushing past him in a blur of motion. It was as though the rules of space had been bent, broken, and he was caught in the current of it all. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Hatch stood there, breathless, his hands gripping the edges of the stall as he tried to steady himself. He looked around. Everything was different. The restroom, once mundane, now seemed almost alive. The air hummed with an unnatural energy, the walls pulsating as though they were breathing in sync with his own heart. He glanced at the terminal, which now displayed a new message. Congratulations, user 5937. You have achieved acceleration. You are now in the top 10% for efficiency. Continue to process. Continue to relieve. Hatch's mind raced. What had just happened? Why had he accelerated? He took a deep breath and stepped out of the stall, the bizarre sensation still lingering in his chest. The bathroom had somehow made him more effective. More efficient. This was what Mavis had meant, wasn't it? The more trips you made, the faster you went, the more power you gained. The concept was simple: speed was power in this farm city, and it was all dictated by the bureaucracy's strange, invisible forces. The more you relieved yourself, the more quickly the paperwork got done, the faster the chickens clucked, the more eggs you received. And when you moved at the right speed, the bureau rewarded you. Hatch didn't know if he wanted to be a part of this game, but as he returned to his desk, he realized something: he had no choice. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, The Egg Quota. Hatch returned to his desk, his heart still racing from the strange acceleration. The office around him had settled back into its monotonous hum, but something felt different. Something in the air was charging, buzzing like static electricity. He tried to shake the sensation off as he sat down, ready to dive back into the sea of paperwork. Eggs, Hatch muttered, staring at the monitor in front of him. More eggs. Less paperwork. That's all they care about. Every transaction in this place revolved around eggs, digitized, verified, and encrypted in the form of blockchain currency. They roamed freely around the city, part of the complex system of exchange. But the real kicker? The more eggs you processed, the more access you had to the system's resources. The bureaucracy had created a truly strange economy, and the workers were its cattle. The sensation from the restroom earlier still clung to Hatch's skin like a thick, uncomfortable blanket. But now, there was a new, almost sickly thrill that gnawed at his insides. What if it wasn't just about paperwork? What if there was a way to gain power, true power, by using the bathroom the right way? Back to the eggs, Hatch said, pulling up the digital ledger. The chickens, too, roamed in their own digital space, each one tagged with a blockchain ID. They were as valuable as gold, and Hatch was a mere cog in the system. But he didn't have to stay that way. If he played the game right, he could climb. He could. The feeling returned. It started as a slight twinge in his gut, but it grew quickly like a low hum vibrating under his skin. Hatch glanced around, making sure no one was watching. No one noticed when you needed a break, right? But this wasn't like before. This was different. It was an undeniable urge, a physical sensation he couldn't ignore. He couldn't even focus on the eggs. They swam in his vision like poorly rendered pixels. And then the hum started to rise in intensity, like a fever pitch, reaching a crescendo of sound as his head swam with dizziness. The bathroom. He needed the bathroom again. Hey, Hatch, you okay? Mavis's voice sliced through his haze of panic. She was standing in the aisle between desks, watching him curiously. You're looking a little off. I'm fine, Hatch managed to say, swallowing the knot in his throat. Just paperwork, you know. But Mavis wasn't fooled. If you're about to have another acceleration moment, you should probably take care of it. You've already done a great job getting to the top 10%. No sense wasting that. Hatch's heart thudded loudly in his chest. She knew. She knew what was happening. He forced a grin. Yeah, maybe I should. Mavis stepped back, offering him a knowing wink. Don't take too long. The quota's high today. Hatch's feet carried him toward the restroom, his movements mechanical as he followed the path laid out before him. He didn't question it anymore, the need was too strong to ignore. He entered the restroom, the sterile, humming air immediately assaulting his senses. The terminal in the corner flickered again, the same message flashing across the screen. Welcome, user 5937. Are you prepared for acceleration? This time, Hatch didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he pressed the button. The familiar rush of motion hit him again, this time with even more intensity. His body lurched, and the walls around him seemed to warp. Hatch blinked, and for a moment, he felt like he was moving faster than his thoughts, faster than anything around him. But something was wrong. Instead of the usual brief moment of disorientation, this time it stayed. He was stuck in the acceleration. The walls were no longer moving at the same speed as him, they were distorted, stretched out like a series of mirrors in a funhouse. His body felt as if it were tearing apart, being stretched in ways it shouldn't be. Then, with a sickening snap, Hatch's vision cleared, and he was standing in front of the mirror, gasping for breath. But something was different. He looked at his reflection. His right arm, his whole arm was gone. His mind raced. What? His heart hammered in his chest as he looked down at the empty sleeve. The mirror reflected the twisted horror of the loss, but it didn't feel like real loss. It felt fluid. As if the missing limb was never supposed to exist in the first place. There was no pain, just a strange numbness. The bathroom stall door creaked open behind him, and Mavis's voice echoed from the threshold. Didn't I tell you? Every time you use the bathroom, you change. You either gain or lose something. It's all part of the game. Hatch stared at her, dumbfounded, as the missing limb began to shimmer, pixels swirling in the air like smoke. He blinked, and suddenly it was back, reformed, whole. No questions asked. No time passed. It was just there again. Why? Hatch asked, barely able to speak. Why does this keep happening? Mavis smiled. Because it's all about speed. The more you relieve yourself, the more your body adapts. The more efficient you become. You're climbing the ranks now, Hatch. But don't forget, every time you increase your efficiency, you change. She gestured to the wall where the clock was ticking relentlessly. The Bureau's always watching. And when they watch, they make sure you keep going. Just like the chickens. Just like the eggs. Always moving forward. Always processing. Hatch stumbled back toward his desk, still rattled by what had just occurred. The changes, the sudden loss and regaining of his arm, all of it felt wrong, but somehow it was all part of the system. And the system didn't care. He returned to his terminal, where the egg quota continued to flash across the screen. It never stopped. It couldn't stop. The Bureau didn't allow it. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4, The Eggs and the Paperwork. The more Hatch tried to focus, the more his head spun. He leaned forward, his eyes squinting at the blinking numbers on his terminal. The egg quota was rising, like a ravenous beast that wouldn't be satisfied. He could feel it in his gut, an ache, a need to keep processing. It wasn't just the paperwork anymore. It was everything. Each transaction felt like a drop of sweat on his forehead, each digit a grain of sand moving through an endless hourglass. Efficient, Mavis had said. She had a knack for stating the obvious. Every minute, every second, the system demanded more. And it was through the bathroom breaks, those strange, fleeting moments, that the real power was gained. But it wasn't just the act itself, it was the way it rewired you, turned you into something else, something faster. The Bureau was about efficiency, and the more you relieved yourself, the more efficient you became. And here Hatch was caught between the mundane task of filling out paperwork and the uncanny transformations that his body kept going through. He'd barely finished processing the last batch of digital chickens, those shimmering bits of data, when the sensation started again. The restroom. He wasn't sure what had triggered it this time. Maybe it was the way his fingers had tapped across the keys, like clockwork, each click sending him into a deeper haze of bureaucracy. Maybe it was the hum of the machines around him. Maybe it was just the desperate urge to keep up, to climb the ranks, to keep gaining power. The warning came to him before the thought had fully formed. The sudden shift in pressure in his bladder, that low, gnawing ache. He looked up from his terminal, instinctively glancing around. Nobody was paying attention. The others were too absorbed in their own battles with paperwork, each of them fighting their own uphill struggle to make quota. Hatch hesitated. He'd just gotten back from the bathroom. Had he really processed enough eggs to justify another break? The rules were hazy, but one thing was clear: the more time you spent in that place, the more power you gained. He rose from his desk. As soon as his feet hit the ground, the sensation of acceleration seized him. It was like an electrical jolt through his entire body, and the walls around him began to blur. His legs carried him almost involuntarily toward the restroom door. But this time, something felt off. The usual hum of the bureau's lighting and machinery was muffled, like he was walking underwater. He passed the cracked windows of the hallway, where the faint glow of neon streetlights flickered outside. The world felt distant, distorted. He was moving too quickly to focus, too quickly to think. The restroom loomed ahead, its walls covered in rows of flickering screens, each one showing a different view of the city. Broken, static images of machinery churning, the grind of life in a society too busy to notice anything outside of the quotas. Inside, the bathroom seemed to swallow him whole, the sterile, bright lights overhead blinding for a moment before his eyes adjusted. Ready, user 5937. The terminal's voice came through in a low hum. The same question. Always the same question. This time, Hatch didn't think about it. He didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He pressed the button. The familiar rush hit him. But it was more intense now, too intense. His body lurched, his head spinning. The acceleration was almost violent, as though the system itself had decided to take him on a ride through chaos. His muscles were pulled in every direction, like the rest of him was too slow to catch up. But then, it happened again. His right leg disappeared. He looked down, feeling the absence like a missing piece of a puzzle. The leg was gone, as if it had never existed. The skin, the bone, the flesh all vanished in an instant, replaced with a soft, shimmering field of static that hummed around the space where his leg used to be. The sensation was maddening. He felt the world moving faster around him, the walls warping in strange ways. The air tasted metallic, and every breath felt wrong, as though something was out of sync. Again. Hatch muttered to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. This wasn't part of the game. Mavis's voice suddenly cut through the haze. Not everything's going to stay in its place, Hatch. The more you speed up, the more you lose. It's part of the system. Get used to it. Hatch stumbled, trying to right himself. His remaining leg wobbled, threatening to collapse beneath him, but he managed to regain his balance. The shimmering static around him cleared for a moment, and there, where his leg had been, was nothing. No limb. Just an empty space, where his body's form should have been. And yet, when he blinked, the leg was back. Restored, as though the system had simply flicked a switch and returned things to normal. You're lucky, Mavis said from the threshold of the restroom. She didn't look surprised by his missing leg, nor did she seem to care. The more you use the bathroom, the more it changes you. The more efficient you become. You just have to be fast enough to keep up. You'll get used to the pieces falling off or disappearing. Why? Hatch asked, his voice shaky as he steadied himself on the sink. His reflection showed the leg whole again, yet his mind couldn't quite grasp the reality of it. Because it's a race, Hatch. And the only way to win is to keep moving faster than the system. The paperwork's just a distraction, but the bathroom's where the magic happens. Hatch shuddered. Magic. He didn't believe in that nonsense. But he knew one thing for certain: every time he used the restroom, the world around him warped. He gained something, lost something, but always moved faster. The bureaucracy had created a system of absurdity and power, and Hatch was learning to play the game. He just had to keep moving. Faster. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, The Chicken Quota. Hatch's head pounded as he stumbled out of the restroom, his body still adjusting to the bizarre sensation of his leg constantly reappearing and disappearing. Each time it shifted, the world around him seemed to warp slightly more. He was caught in a vortex, the dizzying pull of bureaucracy spinning him faster and faster until the walls around him became nothing more than static flickering images of papers, chickens, eggs, and incomprehensible symbols flashing in and out of focus. He took a deep breath and forced himself back to his desk. The terminal blinked with new notifications, a never-ending flow of numbers, columns, and rows. Chicken quota, 53% complete. Hatch had no idea why eggs were used as a currency in the bureau, or how they were generated, but he'd long since stopped asking questions. Efficient, the system hummed in its cold, mechanical voice. Increase productivity to meet the daily farm output. He'd seen the chickens roaming the land of the bureau before. They weren't real animals. Not exactly. They were more like data constructs, little clusters of information roaming freely in the fields of the city, offering digital currency to whoever caught them. Each chicken was worth an abstract number. Sometimes it was eggs, sometimes it was bytes of data, and sometimes it was, more bizarre, more volatile. Every chicken hatched from somewhere deep within the digital farms, springing to life when someone like Hatch clicked the right combination of numbers. They were money. And when you chased them down, you found yourself bending reality in ways you could never explain. Chickens everywhere, Hatch muttered to himself. The absurdity of it was becoming overwhelming. There had been no explanation for how the Bureau's farm system had even started. It had just happened. And it wasn't even the strangest thing about his day. The restroom. Again. Hatch's stomach churned. He knew what was coming. It had become a constant pull now. After every round of paperwork, there was a surge in urgent need to relieve himself. The cycle wasn't over, it was just beginning again. He looked around the sterile office space, the others tapping away at their terminals, oblivious to the strange transformations that were happening within the bureau. One of the co-workers, name unknown, a faceless worker, blurred by static, glanced over at Hatch. They raised an eyebrow, sensing the unease in the air, but said nothing. It wasn't their job to question. Not here. And yet, the bathrooms held the power. It was there, in those few moments of relief, that Hatch realized how much of the Bureau's secret workings were rooted in the inexplicable rituals. Another twinge of pressure pulled at his lower abdomen. The restroom. This time, Hatch didn't question it. He just stood up, moving with a new urgency, almost mechanical in his motions. His body tingled as the acceleration began again. He reached the bathroom with an unnatural swiftness, the same hum in the air as the door swished open before him. He was ready. Or, at least, he thought he was. Inside, the terminal's voice greeted him as usual. User 5937, are you ready? A flashing light from above cast an eerie glow on the walls. Hatch could see the shimmering digital reflection of his own face, the slight twitch in his eye that hadn't been there yesterday. The sensation of acceleration hit him hard again, his body racing before his mind could catch up. His leg, or lack thereof, flickered again, the place where it had been seemed almost vacant, as if reality itself was being torn and patched together like broken code. But this time, something was different. As he sat on the sterile, metallic seat, a series of explosions rang out across the city. Jazz. Not jazz in the sense Hatch knew it. This was not music. It wasn't sound. It was more like the physical manifestation of chaos, punctuated by sharp, staccato bursts of static. The plants that lined the walls of the bureau began to tremble, their leaves quaking, as if the rhythm of the sound was tearing them apart. The flickering lights above him matched the uncomfortable rhythm, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Explosions of decay, Hatch muttered under his breath, clenching his fists as the pressure of his own body of the system's rules grew. The plants, those once fine synthetic life forms, seemed to break apart, splintering into jagged shapes that swirled around him. The air grew thick, and Hatch could hear the growl of his own heartbeat in the chaos. Does it always sound like this, he thought, but before he could gather any more coherent thoughts, the next wave of pressure surged through him. It was happening again. The right leg gone. For the second time in minutes. He closed his eyes, feeling his mind expand as the office world seemed to implode around him. For a split second, the universe felt like it was stretching, cracking open at the seams. Mavis's voice broke through the static, her words steady and unperturbed. Hatch, don't fight it. You're accelerating now. You know what you have to do. He didn't know what she meant. How could he? The system was never this simple, and it was certainly never this wrong. But the rules were the rules, and as the bathroom door slid open, Hatch realized the inevitable truth. The more you used the restroom, the faster you became. And with that speed, came power. The chicken quota was rising again, and Hatch had no choice but to follow the pattern. If he wanted to keep his position, if he wanted to maintain control over his own body, he had to do it. He had to keep going. So he let the chaos wash over him. Let the music echo, let the explosions spread out across the city like sparks from a fire. And as his leg returned to him, fully reformed, his mind sharpened, focused, ready to handle the next stage of the farm game. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, The Farm Secret. The day had begun like any other, but Hatch's head still ached from the bizarre transformation of his body. Each new shift, each new alteration, was a reminder that the Bureau was more than just a government facility. It was a living organism with rules that no one truly understood. Hatch had been warned about the accelerating effects of the restroom, but nothing could prepare him for the uncertainty that came with each change. Today, however, he wasn't just going to follow the cycle. He needed to uncover what was hidden behind the Bureau's endless paperwork, the chickens, the eggs, and the increasingly absurd farm-like operations that seemed to govern the city. There was something off about the way everything worked, and Hatch's body, though disoriented by its own shifting, had begun to sense the pattern. "You're thinking too hard again," Mavis's voice broke through his thoughts. She had always had an unnerving way of sensing when Hatch was spiraling. He hadn't even realized he'd left his desk again until he found himself standing in front of the restroom doors once more. "You need a break. Maybe a chicken chase." "You're still at 42% quota for the day," Mavis continued, unbothered by the increasing tension in Hatch's posture. She didn't understand the deeper unease that crawled beneath his skin. Chickens. The damned chickens. Every day, Hatch was expected to catch them, deliver eggs, and continue generating the farm's artificial economy. But where did it all lead? He had grown up hearing about the natural world, about farms and crops, but this was something else entirely. The city was a farm in the worst way possible, a simulated, hyper-corporate farm that fed off the people's labor, their urgency, their need to keep accelerating just to stay relevant. Hatch paused. "Quotas can wait," he muttered, swiping his hand across his terminal to shut it off. "I need answers." He walked out of the office, not caring that the walls around him flickered with the soft whir of data streams, or that the air smelled faintly of static and burnt plastic. He was headed somewhere more dangerous. Somewhere no one in the Bureau talked about. Somewhere he'd only heard whispers about, the inner barn. It was a location only known to the top-tier agents of the Bureau, the ones who understood the mechanics behind the digital farm system. The ones who knew how the eggs were really made, how the chickens truly functioned. Hatch had been curious about it for weeks now, but he'd never had the courage to ask. No one who sought that kind of knowledge ever came back unchanged. "Going off-grid, Hatch?" Mavis's voice cracked in through his earpiece. "Yep," he said flatly, turning a corner into an alleyway, making sure to avoid the bustling crowds of workers pushing carts full of eggs and chickens. He could see the small, mechanical animals roaming freely, each one powered by some sort of complex algorithm, but no one seemed to notice the strange, abstract nature of their existence. His heart raced, the same strange pressure building in his gut again. He clenched his fists, but before he could push through it, his leg flickered. Gone. The sense of acceleration hit him instantly, and his body shot forward, slamming into a nearby wall. It felt wrong, like the pull of his own body had shifted direction too quickly. Too violently. "Did I break it again?" he groaned, hearing the faintest sound of a jazz note hit the air. The plant life surrounding him trembled and burst into jagged motions, its leaves swaying in impossible rhythms. Jazz, he thought. The musical decay that had become synonymous with his reality. The strange sound seemed to come from the ground itself now, like the earth had begun to play a tune, not of music, but of entropy. He was accelerating, but for what purpose? Still reeling from his transformation, Hatch pressed on, his body now flickering between different planes of existence. He arrived at the entrance to the inner barn, an old, rusted door that seemed almost ordinary when compared to the high-tech chrome and glass of the Bureau's office. It was out of place, and Hatch couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as his fingers brushed against the cold metal. The door creaked open before him, revealing a dark corridor that stretched on longer than he anticipated. The air inside smelled of damp earth and something else, something rotten. He didn't have time to think about it further. He entered, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that sent a ripple of static through his body. "Welcome to the barn," a voice said. Hatch froze. The voice didn't belong to Mavis, or anyone he knew. It was mechanical, robotic, but it had an odd undertone, one that almost sounded human. "Who are you?" Hatch demanded, his eyes darting around. Shadows moved and shifted, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw a glimpse of someone moving just beyond the range of his vision. "Your superior," the voice answered. "And you, Hatch, are no longer just a cog in the system. You've been chosen." The words hit him hard, sending another wave of pressure through his body. He wanted to question it, to resist. But instead, something inside him urged him to keep moving forward. The system. The farm. He was just a piece of it, but maybe there was a way to control it. The walls around him seemed to ripple as if reality itself was being bent by unseen forces. Hatch swallowed hard and stepped forward, deeper into the barn. This was the beginning of something bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7, The Barn's Heartbeat. The hallway felt infinite, like an unending stretch of decaying metal and forgotten machinery. Hatch's footsteps echoed strangely, the sound warped and offbeat, like the world itself was shifting, refusing to remain in sync with him. He had been warned about the barn, but now, standing in the dark corridor, it felt less like a place and more like a living organism, something that was absorbing him, watching him, waiting. He could feel it. The pressure in his body was mounting again, this time more intense, almost unbearable. His stomach churned as if a storm were brewing inside him, and before he could stop himself, his hands were pressed against the nearest wall. His limbs twitched. The unmistakable sensation of acceleration kicked in once more. Without warning, his body lurched forward, faster than he could comprehend, sending him crashing into something hard and metallic. The world slowed. His head throbbed with dizziness, and when the room came back into focus, he was no longer in the hallway. He had entered the heart of the barn. Before him was a vast, open space. Lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie, dim glow that barely illuminated the colossal chamber. It was a bizarre blend of technological decay and organic matter, rusted pipes and mechanical gears intertwined with creeping vines, glowing fungus, and strange pulsing plants. The air was thick with an unnatural hum, a low, reverberating frequency that seemed to sync with the irregular rhythm of Hatch's heartbeat. "Welcome, Hatch," the voice echoed again, softer this time. It came from all directions, as if it had seeped from the very walls. "You've come far. And yet, the true purpose is just beginning." Hatch's pulse quickened, and his eyes darted around, trying to focus. A figure moved in the shadows, tall, cloaked in the same bizarre blend of mechanical and organic armor. The figure raised a hand, and the lights brightened for just a second, enough for Hatch to see the face, pale, worn, like someone who had been here far too long. "What is this?" Hatch asked, his voice rough. He tried to steady himself, but the flickering of the room had begun to affect his perception. His thoughts felt fragmented, as though they were splintering off into disconnected shards. The figure stepped forward. "This is where it all begins, Hatch. The Bureau's control is merely a layer. Underneath it lies the true power, the farm. We are its keepers." Hatch frowned. "Farm? What are you talking about?" "You mean the chickens and eggs?" The figure nodded slowly. "The chickens, the eggs, the currency, it's all part of the system. But it's also more. The farm is not just what you think. It's a living organism, a vast, interconnected web that spans across the city, across this reality. The chickens are currency because the eggs are the key. They hold the essence of what the city is built on." Suddenly, the room around him began to distort again. The walls rippled and shifted, their shapes warping, as if the very fabric of space was unraveling. His body twitched again, an involuntary reaction to the sensation of acceleration building within him. He needed to go. Now. "I need to," Hatch started, but before he could finish the thought, the figure held up a hand. "You'll find no relief here," the figure said, a dark amusement in their voice. "Not from this. Not from what you're becoming." Hatch's stomach twisted, and before he could stop it, his legs moved on their own. The acceleration hit him full force again. This time, there was no stopping it. His body shot forward, faster than he could process. The figure's voice echoed again, but it was no longer clear, just static, punctuated by harsh bursts of distorted jazz music. The sound was as if the room itself was breaking down into something chaotic, frenetic, and utterly unrecognizable. Hatch tried to steady himself, but his body was already in motion, tearing through the barn's winding corridors, his legs flickering in and out of reality as the walls distorted further. The pressure in his body kept building, and with every step, the room seemed to splinter more. He was accelerating in every direction at once until finally, there was nothing left but a sense of pure disorientation. The more you accelerate, the more you ascend, the voice echoed, now distant and muffled. The more you lose yourself, the closer you become to the farm's true purpose. Hatch didn't know what that meant, but it didn't matter. The bathroom beckoned once again. The door was before him, unmarked but unmistakable, just like all the others. He burst through it, his body unwilling to stop, unwilling to understand the deeper meaning of what was happening. The room inside was simple. White tiles. A mirror. A single stall. As Hatch stepped inside, he felt it again. The shift in reality. The world flickered. He looked at himself in the mirror, his face distorted by the acceleration. But it wasn't just his face, his body was changing again. His arm flickered once, then twice. His hand fell away, replaced by a new, metallic one. He hadn't asked for it, but there it was, a cold, mechanical limb where his human hand had been. He stared at it, stunned, as the faint sound of jazz music filled the air. The plants outside the restroom began to vibrate, twitching, their leaves jerking to the rhythm. The room had become alive with the sound of dissonant, chaotic music. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, transfixed by his new arm, when the voice broke through again. "You're becoming one of us now, Hatch. One with the system, one with the farm." And in that moment, Hatch realized the truth. The Bureau wasn't controlling the farm. The farm was controlling them all. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8, The Paper Trail. Hatch stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the new mechanical limb that had replaced his right hand. His mind was racing, fragmented thoughts tangling like the wires in the walls around him. He could feel the rhythmic hum of the plants outside, the strange jazz music that had somehow become the soundtrack of his own unraveling. The limb was cold and alien, but it felt necessary. As if the farm, this place, had chosen him to become more than human. He flexed his fingers, watching as the metal digits moved with a precision that his organic hand never had. It felt strange, foreign, but somehow right. The farm was alive. And he was becoming part of it. Hatch stumbled out of the restroom, his legs still shaking from the acceleration, the odd sensation of having his body torn apart and reassembled coursing through him. He needed to move, needed to get out of this place before it consumed him entirely. But there was something he had to do first. His head throbbed as he moved down the corridor again, the walls closing in, the space shrinking with every step. He needed paperwork. He had to get it. The more papers he filled out, the more control he could gain over this madness. The farm was controlled by bureaucracy, by forms, signatures, approvals. It was ridiculous, but in the absurdity, there was power. Hatch could feel it now. The more he did, the more real this place became. And the more real he became in it. He reached a door labeled Form Processing. Inside, an automated desk sat, and beside it, a stack of forms piled high. A quiet, mechanical hum filled the room, and in front of the desk stood a woman, tall, gaunt, her face half obscured by the glow of a screen. She didn't look up as Hatch entered. "Form 723-9D is ready for processing," she intoned, her voice flat and lifeless. Hatch didn't answer. He didn't need to. His metal hand reached for the pile of papers. He began filling them out mechanically, his eyes glazed over as he scrawled his name and personal information. The more he wrote, the more he felt his body shifting again. His stomach churned in response, the now familiar pressure building. "I need to go," he muttered to himself. He had been using the restroom so much that it no longer felt unusual. But this time, the urgency was different. His body was reacting, shifting in ways that went beyond his control. The woman at the desk finally looked up, her hollow eyes meeting his. "You understand the system now, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hatch didn't answer. The words didn't matter. The bathroom was his priority now. He grabbed the nearest form, stamped it without a second thought, and turned to leave. But before he could get far, the room trembled. A low, grinding sound filled the air. Hatch's body jerked, caught in the unexpected acceleration again. It wasn't just the speed. This time, the world around him was twisting, contorting into something incomprehensible. His arms felt heavy, his legs too light. He lost track of where he was, stumbling forward, only to find himself in another hallway. But this wasn't the same hallway. The walls were now covered in thick, tangled vines. The air was thick with the scent of rotting eggs, and the hiss of electronic static filled the air. Hatch could feel it, the unmistakable presence of the farm pressing down on him. It was everywhere now, and there was no escaping it. Ahead, a door opened, revealing a vast, open space. A field of digital crops. Rows upon rows of chickens, each one pixelated but somehow alive, roaming freely across the land. They clucked and flapped their wings in sync, moving with the rhythm of the jazz music that filled the air. But these chickens were more than just livestock. They were the currency, the lifeblood of this place. Each one was tied to an algorithm, their movements tracked, their worth fluctuating based on the ever-changing rhythms of the farm's economy. A voice crackled from nowhere, a low, crackling sound that cut through the air. The farm is in balance, Hatch. But you, the voice paused, as if considering. You are not. You're disrupting it. The more you accelerate, the more you become part of it. And you'll have to face the consequences. Hatch's heart skipped a beat. The farm. The eggs. The chickens. They were all connected. And now, he was part of it. But something else was happening. Hatch's body was shifting again, and it wasn't just his arm this time. His legs, too, were flickering in and out of reality. It felt like his limbs were dissolving, only to be replaced by something new. A new part of the system. A new part of the farm. He fell to his knees, his breath ragged, as his mind spiraled. The acceleration, the constant shifting, it was becoming too much. He needed to use the bathroom again. He could feel it coming. His body was breaking in ways that weren't possible, weren't real. But it didn't matter. He stood up, his new limbs steady, and made his way towards the nearest restroom. He had to go. He had to fill out more forms. The more he did, the more he became part of the system. The more power he would gain. And maybe, just maybe, he could find out what was really going on. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, The Escalation. Hatch's footsteps echoed through the corridors of the farm as he stumbled towards the restroom, his body trembling with each step. He could feel the familiar pressure building again, his intestines protesting against the unrelenting rhythm of his existence. The more paperwork he filled out, the more his body reacted. But this time, something was different. His limbs felt as though they were shifting, rearranging themselves, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. The door to the restroom hissed open, and Hatch stepped inside, the fluorescent lights flickering above him. The stall was empty, waiting, a quiet haven amid the chaos. But Hatch knew better than to assume that his visit would be anything like the last. No, the farm was evolving, twisting into something darker, something more dangerous. He sat down, his metal hand tapping nervously against the smooth surface of the toilet. The moment his body released, he felt it again, the sensation of acceleration, a sharp jolt, as if time itself was trying to catch up with him. His body lurched forward, his head spinning as the walls seemed to bend, stretch, and warp. He could feel his body stretching, pulling apart, yet somehow remaining in one piece. When it stopped, he was no longer in the restroom. He was standing in the middle of a vast field. But this field was different. The crops, chickens, eggs, and strange digital plants shifted and rippled with the same unpredictable energy that was coursing through his own body. The air hummed with an unnatural rhythm, and the sound of clucking echoed around him. A familiar voice crackled through the air, distorted by static. You've accelerated again, Hatch. You're becoming too powerful. Too aware. You're not supposed to be here. Hatch clenched his fists, his new mechanical hand tightening into a fist. I don't care about your system anymore. I'm done playing by your rules. The ground beneath him trembled, and the chickens, the currency, stopped moving. They froze, their digital forms glitching, flickering like faulty code. The air grew thick with tension, and Hatch could feel it, the deceleration and unnatural pull that was slowing everything down to a crawl. The chickens began to collapse in on themselves, their digital bodies distorting, becoming nothing more than warped shapes, as if the farm itself was rejecting them. And then it happened. The ground exploded. A massive burst of energy tore through the field, sending Hatch sprawling backward. The explosion wasn't just physical, it was auditory. A blast of jazz music, uneasy and frantic, filled the air, the dissonant sounds ricocheting through the chaos. The plants the digital plants began to grow wildly, twisting and writhing in rhythm with the music. Vines erupted from the soil, stretching out like sentient tendrils, grasping at everything in sight. Hatch gasped for breath, trying to regain his footing as the world around him spiraled. The bathroom had been the trigger, he realized. Every time he used it, the farm shifted, accelerating and decelerating, creating new forms of chaos that he could barely comprehend. His body was becoming a part of it, his limbs adjusting, growing, losing, and duplicating with each visit. He was being changed whether he wanted it or not. The sound of a door creaking open echoed across the field. Hatch turned, his eyes narrowing as a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was the woman from the form processing room. But she was different now, her body flickering in and out of existence, her face distorted by the same glitching effects that were consuming the farm. "You're too late," she said, her voice a haunting whisper. "You've already become part of the farm. You can't escape it now." Hatch took a step forward, his new limbs moving with strange, fluid grace. He wasn't sure how, but he could feel the power building inside him, the power of the farm, of the bureaucracy, of the chickens. He had become part of the system, and now he could control it. The ground shook again, this time violently, as more vines erupted from the soil, twisting and writhing like snakes. Hatch's body surged forward, the acceleration overwhelming him. The woman vanished into the chaos, her voice still echoing in his ears, but it was drowned out by the roar of the explosion and the frantic jazz that consumed everything. Hatch clenched his fists, feeling the strange pulse of energy that was now coursing through his veins. He had to keep going. He had to keep accelerating, keep filling out forms, keep using the bathroom. The more he did, the more control he would have. But as he took another step, a horrible realization hit him: he wasn't just part of the farm anymore. The farm was part of him. And as the chaos continued to unfold around him, he realized that there was no way out. Not anymore. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10, The Final Bureaucracy. Hatch stood in the middle of the crumbling field, his body trembling, and his mind lost in the disorienting hum of acceleration and deceleration. The digital plants continued to grow wildly, each pulse of energy sending their tendrils snaking into the air, their vines creating a cacophony of twisting noises that merged with the frenetic jazz music. The chickens, still suspended in their flickering digital forms, clucked incessantly, creating a discordant chorus that echoed in Hatch's ears. It was all becoming too much to understand. The system was no longer just a series of forms, paperwork, and bureaucratic lines. It was alive, living in his veins, in his body, in his every breath. The paperwork had stopped making sense long ago, but the feeling of power, of acceleration, was unmistakable. It was a drug, a necessity. The more forms he filled out, the more paperwork he pushed through the system, the more power he gained. And with that power, came the ability to bend reality itself. But as Hatch's body began to twitch uncontrollably, his limbs shifting in unnatural directions, a voice boomed out, reverberating through the chaos. "You've reached the final level, Hatch." He turned, his head snapping to attention, and there, rising from the center of the field, stood the bureaucrat. The once faceless figure now had a name, a form, an entity made of ink, paper, and bureaucracy, its body swirling with the energy of paperwork. Its voice was a mechanical screech, a combination of glitching static and firm authority. Hatch didn't hesitate. He charged, his body surging forward, propelled by the energy of his last trip to the restroom. But just as he moved, something else shifted. The chickens, now fully integrated into the system of digital currency, began to multiply, their forms scattering across the farm, glitching, merging, and splitting like pieces of broken code. Each cluck was a transaction, a movement of money that triggered a shift in the fabric of reality itself. Hatch's limbs began to split, twist, duplicate, and then twist again. His left arm expanded grotesquely, a second hand forming where his wrist had been. His right leg elongated and fractured, revealing yet another duplicate, another piece of him lost to the farm's bizarre logic. But as his body became more monstrous, the bureaucrat remained still, watching, waiting. "You've learned too much, Hatch," the bureaucrat rasped. "You've tapped into the core of the farm's power. But there is no way out now. You've taken more than you can handle. and the farm will never let you leave. Hatch stumbled, feeling his body collapsing in on itself, his limbs regrowing and disappearing in rapid succession. But through the pain, he felt the rush of control, the acceleration. He was not bound by the same laws as others. The more he used the restroom, the more he interacted with the farm's bureaucracy, the more he could reshape the world around him. The farm's currency, the eggs, the chickens, became more than mere commodities. They were power, tools, energy. Each transaction pulled him closer to the truth. In one final act of defiance, Hatch reached for his jacket pocket, his fingers trembling as he retrieved the final form, the form he'd filled out years ago, the one that had set all of this in motion. It was stained with ink, soaked with the sweat of bureaucratic labor, but it was his key to everything. With it, he could accelerate beyond the farm's reach. But as he held it aloft, a sound like 1,000 clucking chickens erupted around him. The ground beneath him cracked, and the vines, now fully grown into living plants of bureaucracy, shot upward, wrapping around him like ropes of authority. The chickens scattered again, multiplying faster than he could comprehend, their forms twitching with digital energy. The jazz music blared louder, a discordant swell that shook the earth. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The farm, the digital plants, the chickens all froze. The world stood still. The papers, the forms, the bureaucracy, everything that had been feeding the cycle of acceleration and deceleration came to a grinding halt. Hatch stood there, breathing heavily, his limbs still twitching and warping. He wasn't sure if it was real anymore. His reflection in the blackened glass of the form desk before him was distorted, half human, half machine, half something else entirely. His face, unrecognizable, seemed to shift every time he looked at it. The bureaucrat was gone. In its place was an empty desk. A single piece of paper lay on it, the final form undisturbed, untouched, waiting. Hatch stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached forward, his hand trembling, and grabbed it. "Complete the form," a voice whispered from behind him. It wasn't the bureaucrat, it was a new voice, unfamiliar, distant. "And the cycle will start again." Hatch dropped the form, his breath shallow. His body, now fully warped by the strange logic of the farm, trembled as he turned away. He had escaped, but he hadn't. The farm was still inside him. It always would be. And as he walked away, the sound of clucking chickens, the rustle of digital leaves, and the faint echoes of uneasy jazz followed him, merging into a distorted symphony of the farm's endless bureaucracy. The end.